So I've been using an M1 iPad Pro for over 2 weeks now, and even though this isn't my full review of the device, I do have some new updates and thoughts that I want to share. Mainly the first one I want to talk about, I had this realization, this aha about why an iPad will never have macOS put onto it. But first, check out this new setup, and what I mean by that, I finally got my OBS equivalent on the iPad, and it's called Camo Studio, and I'm recording everything off of this directly. And from the tests that I've used right now, everything records smoothly, seamlessly, and maybe even efficiently. Quite frankly, people, believe me, okay? I've been using the iPad virtually for everything except for one thing, but I'm going to say that for a future video. It has to do with logic. But that's not what we're talking about today. Today, let's talk about macOS and the iPad. I have only used my MacBook Pro now once, and that was to record my podcast with my fellow co-hosts over at Tailosive. The first week I was doing the podcast, I recorded everything off of the iPad, and evidently there was some type of video hiccup issue. I'm not really too sure what happened, but just to play it safe and because it lives outside the realm of the Randy Nexus, I did not want to put anybody through the hassles of troubleshooting that stuff, so I just filmed the following week's podcast on my MacBook. But once I was done, I closed the lid, I put it away, and then that was it. We're done. I have used this iPad now for everything, and many times now I have forgotten that I'm not using macOS. But then I'm like, okay, why? Because there is still a degree of separation that makes me realize that this is still iPad. And then it kind of hit me in a way that I was already articulating before, but now I think I can make it a little bit more concisely. The main reason why the iPad will never get macOS, at least not with the current leadership at Apple, is because of money. And we're not talking about cannibalizing sales. I'm not talking about the iPad then replacing the Mac. Apple doesn't care about cannibalizing sales. That's true. I've said it before. It's true then. It's true now. The money has to come from the developers. The Mac is an open source platform. You can download anything to anywhere at any time, whenever you want. Yes, there are Mac dedicated apps that you can get through the Mac App Store, and Apple does get their cut, that 30%. But there's so much that I've downloaded off of my Mac that has nothing to do and never did go through Apple. OBS being one. Downloading my YouTube videos, making them MP3s, that's an app, didn't go through Apple. Discord, Spotify. I mean, shoot, really anything that has a .com and then says download to your Mac, that's not going through an app store. That's directly from the vendor to the customer, and Apple gets no cut of that. And as I've stated in my Understanding iPadOS video, unlike the Mac, the iOS platform, the great and holy grail of iPhone, everything, and I mean everything, goes through Apple. There are no apps that you can download onto your phone that do not come through the App Store, and whatever goes through the App Store, Apple gets a cut. It's a good business model, especially when they leaned into the whole services strategy of making money. And for end users like you and me, the consumer, we might not be paying anything, but somebody's paying something. This is now a business relationship between developers and the hosting platform, which is Apple. And because the iPhone was so successful, like I said before, every new product since then that has come out from Apple is tailored somehow, some way. It is linked and directly affiliated with the iOS platform. Why? Not because of the phone, not because of the camera, and not because of the USB-C or MagSafe accessories, because of the App Store. Everything's built around apps now. Now, the pro side of that, and why I've been enjoying using iPadOS lately as my only computer, is because everything runs so smoothly. Two things can be true at the same time. Apple wants to make more money, and Apple wants to have a better experience over the user experience. They want to have better control over that whole thing. I have experienced zero lagging on the iPad, which I cannot say the same for my MacBook. I love how powerful my Mac is. I love what it can do for me within Logic and Final Cut and all the things that I use for. But there are sometimes delays, hiccups, lagging, and something that just doesn't work efficiently. I hear the fans kicking on with the MacBook sometimes. This M1 iPad does not get hot. It is so efficient and seamless. And yes, there's workarounds, and I have to figure out those workarounds. But I think it's somewhat inevitable. As long as we stay on the app trajectory for iPad, there's just going to be refinements after refinements about making it better. We are going to blur the lines more about what we want from iPadOS because of macOS without the two OSs ever overlapping. But this does not just fall on the developers. No, it does have to fall on Apple and making a better file management system protocol. But with the developers, they have to make certain apps. Like, I don't see why there couldn't be an OBS app for iPad. Now that I'm using this Camo Studio, I realize that, like, oh, they just don't make one. They don't have to, and they choose not to. But if they did, and if they could, then great, you stick with what you know. But if they don't and they haven't, you find alternatives to everything, and it does work very, very well. But that does mean that more developers have to get on board with iPadOS, which means they have to choose to then maybe give a bit of a cut to Apple with when they make those dedicated iPad apps. But I would not be surprised if I see a time in my lifetime that the next generations long after me only use these more mobile OSs like an iPad or an iPhone, and they just get that much more beefed up. If the next generation is trained on using these models, then okay, then that's the one that might take the reign on all things computing. But I will say, until you can make a full dedicated app on the iPad for an iPad, the iPad isn't there. Not yet. In a vacuum, once the self-contained hardware and the software starts making its own software, then I'll be like, okay, this app was made completely on iPadOS for iPadOS. That's when I feel Mac might be in trouble just a little bit, but not for someone like me. My generation, I think I'm just gonna stick with a Mac. Maybe even Gen X might stick with a Mac. But at some point, Gen Alpha or somewhere down in the future, someone's going to be an all-only mobile generation just using these types of devices, and then whatever comes after them. But anyway, that's it for right now. I just wanted to share this revelation that I had that, oh, what's holding back the iPad isn't necessarily just on one party alone, whether, albeit it might be Apple, even though they could make better improvements on macOS, but the developers as well. And for the legacy developers that don't want to make apps for iPad, I say that's fine because it's a free world, a free market. I support that, but someone will. Someone will make an alternative to your app. And that became prevalent to me when I found my OBS alternative, and it works flawlessly. What do you think? Do you agree or do you disagree? Let me know and get subscribed, because the next video I'm going to put out will have to do with all things exclusive and proprietary to using Logic Pro and writing a song on the iPad exclusively. So we will talk then.